Dear participants, good afternoon. I hope that so far you have had a fruitful and interesting workshop. What I would like to do in this brief video is to give you some flavor of the land restitution process as it took place and as it is still taking place in Iraq, and to highlight some of the four key lessons that I think the Iraqi experience can bring to the table when we discuss land restitution in transitional contexts. I was involved in Iraq for a number of years, working on a number of different land issues, and part of that time was spent as one of the technical advisors from IOM to the Property Claims Commission, which is the institution in the process that I would like to talk to you about today. Before going into land restitution and how Iraq developed and implemented the land restitution policy, I will give you a little bit of background information on displacement in Iraq. I will not go into too many details, but I think it's important to get a full picture of displacement in Iraq, or at least not a full picture, but at least the contours of the displacement problem in Iraq, to better understand the complexity and the challenges that the land restitution process has faced and continues to face in Iraq. Iraq has seen in the past decades a number of successive waves of forced displacement. The first displacement took place in or during the period of the Ba'ath Party reign over Iraq, which lasted from 1968 to 2003. There are a number of forced displacement waves, if you like, that we could talk about, but I want to highlight one because it caused or it generated a lot of the work and certainly the most complex work that the Property Claims Commission in Iraq has had to deal with. And this is the Arabization, as it is called, of the northern provinces in Iraq, and specifically the oil-rich province of Kirkuk. In essence, the government forcibly displaced Turkmen and Kurdish communities from their ancestral lands and replaced them with Arabs from the south and especially the center of Iraq. The latter being encouraged to go to the north by access to free or very cheap land and support to establish themselves as farmers in those regions. One of the main drivers of these forced population movements was the desire by the regime to ensure that the oil-rich province would be populated by populations that they saw as more loyal to the regime and that were less likely to pose a threat to their power in this strategically very important area of Iraq. Then again, there was a new wave of displacement, if you like, in the period between, I would say, 2003, 2005. What happened was to some extent a peace dividend when, or a regime change dividend, to put it more accurately. When the regime fell after the US-led invasion, a lot of the people that had been forcibly displaced by the regime started to return to their lands and their homes. Of course, the problem was that in the meantime, more often than not, other communities, other households, other individuals were living in those houses and on those lands. And so a lot of private score settling occurred, whereby a lot of people either were forced to flee or people decided that the situation had become so insecure and politically so worrisome that they decided to move away, often outside Iraq. And there were certainly a lot of people that fled after the regime fell to Jordan in particular, but also to Syria. Then in 2006, 2007, Iraq saw an upflare of sectarian violence across the country, but specifically also in Baghdad. And what you had is, because of the sectarian violence, is in Baghdad, for example, communities that used to be mixed, Shia, Sunni, were now becoming, because of the violence, either exclusively Sunni or exclusively Shia. And very often minority or Sunni, who would be in a minority in a majority Shia area, would be forced to move to a majority Sunni area, and the other way around. And then, of course, we have all seen on the television with the growth and the violence committed by ISIS, that has again created a whole new emergency situation and has created a lot of forced displacement, specifically towards the Kurdish area, centered around Erbil, but also in other parts of Kurdistan. Currently, we estimate that there's about 2.5 million internally displaced persons in Iraq and around 2 million refugees, especially in the neighboring countries. My presentation will focus exclusively on the land restitution policy as it was established to deal with forcible land and property takings under the Ba'ath Party regime, so for the period 1968 to 2003. But it will become clear, I think, from the way I have set out these multiple ways of displacement, that the reality of land and property issues in Iraq is a lot more complex, where you have now, in the meantime, multiple layers of displacement that have affected often particular regions and areas, and whereby land is now claimed by 4, 5, 6 different people, or will be claimed if and when stability returns to the country. But let me focus on the Iraq Property Claims Commission, which was established to deal with violations that were committed by the Ba'ath Party regime. The origins of the commission, the thinking behind the establishment of the Iraq Property Claims Commission was very much influenced by what the international community did in Bosnia, where after ethnic cleansing that occurred specifically in Sarajevo, but also elsewhere in Bosnia, after the Yugoslav wars, it was decided to undo that ethnic cleansing and to return the properties back to those people that had been forcibly displaced from them. So the philosophy behind the Iraq Property Claims Commission was initially very simple. The idea was to undo the land and property rights violations committed by the Ba'ath Party regime, and the only remedy that was available for the victims of those violations was land restitution. This was later changed into providing not only the claimants with an option to ask for compensation rather than land restitution, but also allowing the Commission to refuse land restitution and to provide financial compensation instead, if it was found that land restitution was too complicated to implement. And it certainly, this particular change underscores the difficulties that one has with doing land restitution when you need to go back so long in time, as was the case in Iraq. And the Commission, or the legislators in Iraq, recognized that and moderated the restitution only approach from the Commission after a few years of functioning. The Iraq Property Claims Commission is a standalone entity that was established by a dedicated Iraqi law in 2004. It has a central secretariat in Baghdad, and it has 33 judicial committees all around Iraq. And it's the judicial committees that take the first instance decisions on land restitution claims, to the extent that those claims fall within their own geographical jurisdiction. So each judicial committee has a particular geographical jurisdiction. The appeals process is not done by the Commission itself. Initially, it was an appeals board that was dedicated for the process, but now this has been transferred a couple of years ago to the Iraqi Court of Cassation. So all the claims or all the claimants or the parties to the claim that want to appeal the decision by the Judicial Committee need to file an appeal with the Iraqi Court of Cassation. The Iraqi Court of Cassation does not rule on the substance of the claim, but rather either confirms the decision by the Judicial Committee, or finds that there has been an error in law and then returns the decision to the Judicial Committee that then has to decide again upon the same claim. The process, it's a quasi-judicial process with a lot of features, and throughout the life of the Commission, I would say increasingly a lot of features of an ordinary judicial process as it takes place in Iraq. There has to be at least one hearing, so the parties are heard in person, which can often be very challenging, especially when you have cases where multiple heirs come. So there's a lot of work that goes into organizing and holding these hearings. There are experts that parties can use to evaluate, for example, the property. There is also possibility of site visits for the Judicial Committee. Sometimes they will go on site if there's disputes over boundaries of the property, for example. And there is a heavy reliance on Iraqi or ordinary Iraqi civil and procedural law for all the topics that are not covered under the specific law that established the Iraq Property Claims Commission. For example, maybe the key element of ordinary Iraqi law that plays is inheritance law. And inheritance law is very important in the caseload that the Commission is dealing with, given the fact that many of the original owners of the properties have died since they were displaced from their land in the late 60s, in the early 70s, and so on. And very often the Commission is actually dealing with heirs. So the inheritance law has a critical role in the work that the Commission actually does. I should maybe add one particular element of the Iraq Property Claims Commission, and that is that when the property is returned to the original owner, the current occupant of the property has the right to compensation of full present-day market value, unless that current occupant was involved in the forced displacement, him or herself. So if he or she was, for example, part of the local Baath Party government and was instrumental in forcing the original owner out of the land or out of the house, he or she will not be entitled to receive compensation. But in reality, almost, I would say, 90 to 95% of current occupants receive full market compensation, full market value compensation at present day prices, and that has been a huge financial burden on Iraq, on the Iraqi government, and I'll come back to that. The high levels of compensation has been one element in the limited enforcement of the decisions so far. Some figures. The Commission has received a total of 167,000 land restitution claims since its inception until the deadline, which I think, if I remember correctly, I think the claims filing deadline was end of 2009, if I remember correctly, or 2008. In any case, this deadline, this is now the full total of claims. The Commission can no longer receive any new claims, and it's 170,000. The Commission has taken 169,000 decisions. This may sound odd that there is more decisions than claims, but this is because this includes first instance decisions. It also includes the decisions that the judicial committees had to take on the same cases if and when the cassation court returned the case back to the judicial committees. And unfortunately, the way the Property Claims Commission keeps its data, it's impossible to disaggregate, and it's impossible to know in how many cases have actually received a final decision today. So I've just given you the number. It is, of course, an indication of the enormous amount of work that the Commission has done. However, when we look at enforcement of the decisions, we have quite a different picture. And so far, on the latest figures that I have, and they were provided to us by the Commission a couple of weeks ago, only 13,000 decisions have actually been implemented or enforced. So it means that if we look at between 2004, when the Commission was established, 2015 today, in 11 years, less than 10% of the cases actually have been fully resolved, because of course for the claimants a case is only finished when a decision is enforced or implemented. There are a number of different reasons for this very low number of enforcement. I'll come back to that maybe when I talk about one of the key lessons learned from Iraq, but I can mention two elements. And first, the element is that financial compensation, the budget that has been provided by the Minister of Finance to provide compensation to those occupants that lose out the property when it's returned to the original owner, has been insufficient on a yearly basis. It's important to note that the Property Claims Commission is not itself in charge of implementing or enforcing its decisions. That is done through a separate process, and I'll come back to that later on. And the compensation is paid for by the Ministry of Finance, but that process has not worked very well. The second reason is that the Commission's decisions have been implemented in environments that were politically very tense and often very difficult, with very difficult sectarian relations. And very often the police has simply not been willing or able to actually force people who lost the property because of land restitution decision against them out of their houses, especially if they had not yet received their financial compensation. So when it comes to enforcement, the process has been rather disappointing, and that is certainly something that Iraqi parties to the claims will tell you. What are now what are some of the key lessons? And as I said at the outset of my presentation, I would like to focus on four lessons that I think Iraq brings to the table when we talk about land restitution in transitional contexts. The first lesson, I think, is that dealing with large-scale land and property rights violations needs to occur within a broader framework of transitional justice. What happened in Iraq was that land and property issues were dealt with in isolation from how to deal with the past, the violent past of the Ba'ath Party regime more broadly. It didn't look at issues like truth about the past. It didn't look at issues like redress for other types of human rights violations. It didn't look at issues of how that should be related to any type of punitive justice that should occur. There was some punitive justice that occurred, but again, it was not part of the process. And I think critically also, it was not really based upon a broad political discussion, let alone consultations amongst broader victim groups or affected communities about how Iraq should be dealing with this past and with this violence and crimes that were committed by the former regime. I think there are two elements that we can point towards that in the Iraqi context that were certainly negative consequences of not having dealt with land and property rights violations in a more holistic transitional justice approach. The first is that what happened was that, or what the result of this was, that it was only victims of land and property rights violations that received redress for the violations that occurred to them. The people who had been tortured, the people who had lost their family members to political assassinations, people that had suffered from all sorts of other physical crimes committed by the regime, there was no comprehensive or there was no program that was established for them to provide them with remedies, which led to a lot of bitterness, where some people said, well, and especially I think this was an issue for the poorer and the more marginalized communities that did not have property to claim back, and that said, look, property owners are getting their property back, but I lost my son and I never received anything, not even a formal recognition that this has happened to me. So that is certainly one negative consequence that one can highlight in Iraq. The second negative consequence of not dealing or approaching these land issues from a more holistic transitional justice process is that there was no external coherence between what the Commission was doing and what other government entities were doing. And it was not seen as a holistic all of government approach to dealing with the past, but it was, well, land issues, that's for the Commission. And a very concrete example, which was very difficult to understand for those, the victims for whom the Property Claims Commission was supposed to work, was that the Ministry of Finance, because of their ordinary rule that in every case where public funds are at stake and where the ruling goes against the state, they have to automatically appeal that decision. Now, as I just explained earlier, the current occupiers of property that was returned to former owners always received financial compensation paid for by the Iraqi state. So in every single positive decision that the Commission would take, there was a negative impact on the public funds. And so the Ministry of Finance would, in application of a normal business rule that they have, would automatically appeal against those decisions taken by the Commission, which not only caused an enormous amount of work for the appeals body, it caused very long delays in resolving the cases, but it also led to incomprehension by the victims, who saw on the one hand the state establishing a process that would give them justice, and on the other hand the state appealing a decision that was made in their favor, because of course during the appeal the land restitution per se could not take place until the issue of financial compensation was settled. So this issue of external coherence and making it a whole of government approach, I think, also plead in favor of looking at land and property issues in the transitional environments from a broader dealing with the past perspective, and not just focus on it as a single problem that needs to be addressed. Secondly, and I think that it's very complicated, because very often in these transitional contexts there's a lot of political pressure to address land violations that took place, but to the extent that it is feasible, it is really important to have a deep understanding of what the land and property rights relations were before the conflict, or in this case of Iraq, under the former regime, or before the former regime started its policy of taking properties away, before embarking upon a large-scale land restitution process. Let me give a very concrete example why I think it is important to have a good understanding of land and property relations before the conflict, or before the violations took place. In certain parts of Iraq, land and property relations before Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party came to power were characterized by a heavy concentration of property in the hands of a limited number of families. And one of the consequences of the policies that Saddam implemented, admittedly not with respect to the full rights of former owners, and obviously with a lot of violence, but one of the consequences was to have a more diversified nature of land and property relations in those areas, with a lot more people owning smaller plots, to put it a little bit simplistically, than was the case before. Now, when you then implement a large-scale land restitution process that goes back to this earlier situation, you have to ask the question whether it's desirable for the new Iraq to have a situation where land is concentrated in the hands of a few families. And I think it's something that is worth a discussion, even in contexts where there's not a lot of emotion involved in, and understandably so and justifiably so, in redressing past violations. Is this past situation a situation that is desirable to go back to, or is it likely to put the seeds for future conflict, or does it raise serious issues of social justice if you go back, as is the case for some areas in Iraq, to a situation with high levels of land concentration? Because then, of course, if you then go back earlier in time, you find out that those families that had those properties also often got those through coercion, or through being very close to the den, either the colonizers, or being very close to the earlier regime in Iraq, the pre-Ba'ath Party regime. So this question of really understanding the land and property relations before the situation to understand whether it's feasible, whether it's desirable from a social justice perspective, and maybe from a reconciliation perspective, from a peace building perspective, or even from a economic development perspective, to go back to that situation, I think needs to be part of the discussion that one has when one looks at how to deal with past land and property rights violations. A third lesson, and is I think, and that's very important to emphasize, is that when a large-scale land restitution process is established, it is really important to ensure that the procedures and processes through which land restitution will occur are apt for the context, for the number of cases that the entity who is in charge of land restitution will have, the complexity of those cases, the type of documentation that is available, the type of claimants the process is likely to have, and to ensure that it is not automatically assumed that applying ordinary judicial processes and ordinary judicial rules are likely to be the best solution for such a special dealing with the past effort of undoing land and property rights violations. In Iraq, we did a lot of work with the judges to try to have them adopt, and these were usually very senior judges who had been working for many decades in Iraq's civil law, and to have them adapt their practices to become more victim-centered than they would normally be in ordinary court procedures, where the issue of being victim-centered doesn't really pose itself so much, especially not in civil cases. This can concern a number of different issues. For example, one key issue that we worked on with the judges was the language that was being used in the processes, during the hearings, in the letters that were being sent out, to make sure that they were as accessible and as understandable as possible, especially in areas where victims were relatively poor and did not necessarily have a lot of experience in dealing with the judiciary. It can be about the type of evidence that is required. There is no point in asking for evidence that, yes, in a normal civil procedure, one would be asking for that, but in such a transitional context, information that claimants are unlikely to be able to provide. There is no point in insisting that people have a copy of the property deed from the property registration department if we know that a lot of those offices were destroyed and that a lot of the victims of land and property rights violations will not be able to provide this type of documentation. And then other creative evidentiary rules need to be designed. It's not so much about what these rules should be, but it is that the process and the procedures need to have the flexibility to integrate these particular challenges that one faces in a dealing with the past situation that one does not face in ordinary times. The third element has to do with the magnitude of the process and the question whether the procedures and the processes are really adapted to dealing with a very large number of cases in a relatively short period of time. And very often there is a lot of pressure in transitional contexts to do this type of processes quite quickly. People will not have much faith in institutions, will get very often or very quickly disappointment if they see no process, and also very often are waiting, and this was the case in Iraq, for a solution from the Commission before they can get on with their lives and return to their lands, return to their homes, and so on. And then it's really critical to ensure that the process does not become too much of a bureaucracy. And I think one of the things that we worked on with the Commission, and I have to say with varied degrees of success, is to ensure that we had that there were people inside the Commission who were process specialists and who were constantly reviewing the processes that the Commission was using, from everything to claims intake, claims decision, communication with the claimants, internal communication, how to write the decisions, to make sure that these processes were as effective and as efficient as possible. And it is very often when these processes go slow, it can be down to very what look like minute technical issues. Like, for example, in the Iraqi case, one of the discussions, and it's more than a technical issue, was whether the judges should write the full decisions themselves or whether they should use pre-drafted decisions, because there were a number of typical cases that were recurring. And of course, if you use pre-drafted decisions, for example, that goes a lot faster than judges having to write each decision afresh. So this type of ensuring that these processes and these procedures are adapted to the particular nature of land restitution in transitional context is really critical. And I think the Iraqi process has really suffered from taking on too much of a normal judicial process and has slowed things down, I think, unnecessarily to some extent. And then the final point that I wanted to raise is it's really very important when one establishes a dedicated process and a dedicated institution for land restitution to identify what are all the other institutions around this new entity that will also need to play a role in the land restitution process, and what type of resources, information, training do they need to be able to play their role. I'll give a number of examples in the Iraq Property Claims Commission. The Iraq Property Claims Commission, when it was established, attracted a lot of support, a lot of international funding. They had good offices, good computers, and so on. They had a very performant database. Their staff was relatively well trained quite quickly. But then once they started to process claims, they needed to rely very heavily on the property registration offices all around Iraq to provide them with copies of the property deeds. Now, these offices were usually understaffed, had no computers, were doing everything on paper, were overwhelmed with their daily work, and certainly did not have the capacity nor the inclination to start working with the Property Claims Commission. So initially the whole process grinded to a halt because the property registration offices never got any additional resources to fulfill those functions that came on top of their normal work, i.e. providing those deeds to the Property Claims Commission. Also, very often the local property registration offices were simply not aware what this Property Claims Commission was, what they were supposed to do, why they should even, because the law said that the other institutions had to answer to requests for information from the Property Claims Commission, but at the local level, very often those administrators were not aware and were refusing to collaborate. There was also some administrative jealousy involved in saying that, look, this Property Claims Commission have fancy cars, have fancy computers, and we have nothing. So that is something, it's one example, but it's something that by thinking through initially, these are the different institutions that need to work together with that Property Claims Commission, and we are going to provide them also with particular support that could have facilitated the process a lot. Another example is the police, which was required in the Iraqi context to enforce decisions. Police was not necessarily informed ahead of time of what their role would be in relation to this property restitution effort. They were certainly never heard about whether or not their role was feasible in certain of those areas. And again, that is something that could have been dealt with from the outset if they would have been involved in the process from day one. So really a full understanding of what are these different institutions that will need to play a role and how can we engage them in the process early on so that they can facilitate the task and in essence make land restitution possible. This is, which I hope will have been a useful overview of the Iraq process and some of the lessons learned. And if the technical aspects are under control, I should now be on Skype to answer any questions that you may have. And thank you very much for listening to me. And again, my apologies that I cannot be there in person. Thank you.